All right, everyone. Sometimes a politician or other public figure will think that they've hit some sort of slam dunk, like a really, like it's uplifting and it's charismatic and wow, people can't possibly, disagree with me on this one. But it just doesn't come off quite the right way. Cue the Detroit rally the other day in which Lizzo and Usher and others were gloating about, how wonderful Kamala Harris was. Lizzo, in a surprising moment of clarity, I'm like, is she like trying to stab Kamala Harris in the back? I don't even know at this point. Politics has become very strange at the moment. She says, well, if Kamala wins, the entire country will be like Detroit. Now, of course, she's fixated on, well, Detroit residents are resilient and we've got a strong will. And so, okay, that's perfectly fine. What is Detroit generally known for, even by many people who live in Detroit? A fucking shithole. It's known as an extremely high crime city with a dysfunctional city government, which has had to be bailed out numerous times, can't keep the streetlights on, the police don't even operate in parts of the city. It's slowly crepitating. There's probably more abandoned buildings in most neighborhoods than there are inhabited buildings, unless you count squatters and things like that. You have Hell Night, and it's actually kind of useful because it helps to cheaply clear out some of those abandoned buildings. You've got empty derelict factories, economic backwardsness. That's basically Detroit. The only good thing about Detroit is outside of the city limits, which is the airport in Fort Wayne County is actually pretty great. It's one of the most functional and efficient airports I've ever been in. With regards to everything else, though, it's a fucking shit. It was even more of a fucking shit 10 years ago. Like, there are a couple of things that have recovered there, but not much. You've still got massive amounts of crime, huge amount of gang activity. You've got the migrant crisis definitely coming in full swing. I'm surprised that some of those derelict buildings haven't been partially patched up by the illegals that are pouring in to use as like heavily armed drug dens and trafficking locations and stuff like that. Hell, I wouldn't be surprised if that's actually the case. Maybe somebody can DM me on Twitter. It wouldn't surprise me at all. You've got a handful of areas around Detroit, and certainly the very core center of the city. Those are navigable. Those areas are capable of functioning. Everything in between, all the old industry, dilapidated, collapsing, in ruins. The former suburbs, which had been quite posh at the time, it was called the Paris of the West, the Paris of the Americas, rather, with all the alabaster and everything else. If you look at some of those old abandoned buildings, in their heyday, they were quite lovely. Then you had economic backwardsness. You had the expansion of left-wing policies. You had the migration of U.S. heavy industry to the coasts because of import and export being more important than domestic consumption, largely because of left-wing economics. And then, of course, you get race riots and things like that, and people that were of means said, I'm not going to deal with this shit. My factory just closed down, and now people are burning and looting. I'm leaving. And so they moved further out to other communities, service communities. And those areas now are being infected too. So the cancer that was mainly in Detroit city limits is beginning to expand outwards. You look at some of the surrounding areas and you can see this for yourself. Lizzo's saying the silent part out loud. I'm sure that Kamala, by the way, is very happy about this part of her speech. It was immediately seized upon by people who know anything about Detroit. Going overhead, for example, you can see the decay in Detroit. You can see it from a fucking plane. If you fly into the Fort Wayne airport, again, the airport itself is perfectly great. What do you see? Huge swaths of the city have been gobbled up by nothingness. I mean, it's got a lot more trees now. The air pollution level must be a lot lower. I mean, considering the population is now about half of what it was at peak. Yeah, you've got enormous chunks. You've got entire neighborhoods where there's like 2 houses and maybe they're inhabited. Maybe they're not. Maybe animals go in there at night and have parties. Maybe squatters are living there, hobos and shit like that. The industry dried up. There's not a lot of jobs. Unemployment is very high there, and crime is very high there. And it's partially the fault of the city government. If you look at the city government's meanderings, you remember back during the last crisis, I think this was late Obama era, if I remember correctly. Maybe 2014 or so. I can't remember the exact year. You remember the Detroit City Council meetings and how dysfunctional they were? It didn't even make any sense. It's like watching, the middle school debate team try to figure out how to run, a SimCity file. This is basically, I think that we should put the industry right next to the residential zones. Parks? Who needs those? We'll just make sure that there are a bunch of empty spots in the city and we'll just let them sort of fill themselves in. That's basically what's happened with Detroit. It's a totally dysfunctional city. Lizzo is fixated on, well, the people of Detroit were resilient. Yes, she shouldn't have to be that resilient. You know, Godspeed to you, I suppose. If you're still living in the Detroit city limits, you must be very, very willful. Yes, you're very resilient because you have to deal with horse shit. But you shouldn't have to. It would be possible to restructure Detroit, but it would require a huge investment, and it would require actual planning, which is something that the people in Detroit City Council are apparently incapable of doing. You can see the rot and decay from a fucking plane. It's not difficult to see. No offense to any Detroit clankers, but I feel sorry for you more than anything. There are a few gated communities, you know, sort of along the shoreline that look like they're still inhabitable, but they have like their own private security because the police can't save them. And even then, there are going to be problems with crime and drug dealing and trafficking and all this shit. It's only a matter of time before those communities are overrun too, probably. I don't know why anyone would want to live within 10 miles of the Detroit city limits. And then if you go to the west, then you get Flint and shit like that, and that's arguably even worse at this point. That's metastasized from Detroit. A new community is being parasitized by the same forces that be. So yeah, if Kamala Harris wins, that's what you can enjoy. Rot, decay, an end to U.S. industry, people migrating out of urban areas because they become uninhabitable. And it's funny, it is actually happening. You look at Aurora, Colorado, for example, where the Venezuelan gangs are taking over apartment complexes. Or more recently in other communities as well. The decrepitation is spreading from community to community. Once one community has been collapsed, like a swarm of locusts, people are going to go where the going's good. You can't, for instance, sell drugs or traffic if you don't have a clientele to buy the drugs or the whores. So what you do is you destroy one town, and then you move to the next town. It's as simple as that. It's like a spread. It's like a virus, actually. Once it's killed off one cell, it just explodes, and then it moves on, and the little viral particles move on to the next cell. So yeah, Lizzo's, she's being honest. I don't disagree with her. She's being very forthcoming. It's just not necessarily the pitch, the slogan that you want to go with. Make America Detroit again. That should be a slogan. Somebody needs to print up posters like that with Kamala's face and plaster them around for Election Day. Yeah, make America like Detroit again. I'm sure that the average person will be very receptive towards that. I've always wanted to go to 8 Mile Road. That's about all. Peace out.